Welcome to episode 5 of Ponderings from Across the Pond. In this episode, I asked Christelle her top 10 aspects of her life that she's learned about herself in the last 10 years, to which we end up with quite a long, in-depth discussion about one of them. And you'll have to watch or listen to find out. I'd love to ask you a question. What have you discovered about yourself in the last 10 years?
That is a huge span for me. That is a really big span.
Okay.
Because what are we in 2021? That's going back to 2011.
Okay.
Wow.
So,
James.
So Christelle, what have you learned about yourself? Big or small, diagnosed, non-diagnosed, in the last 10 years?
Everything. In the last 10 years is when I discovered I was extremely codependent.
Okay.
And I had to learn what that was. And I had to learn what it would mean to overcome that and no longer be that. I learned and was diagnosed that I'm ADHD.
Okay.
For the first time in the past 10 years. I learned what that looks like, and rather than being a disability, I can use it as an opportunity.
So what were things that you noticed in terms of the ADHD? How did you see it? How did you feel it? How was it picked up? And tell us a bit more about that.
My journey to being diagnosed with ADHD is actually a friend who worked in, I believe it's called special education, I'm not sure, told me that I was ADHD. You know what's funny is I'm realizing that it's my close friends who have pointed things out to me, and then I go investigate that. So she pointed it out. I began investigating and realized, okay, definitely that. The first time I went to get an official diagnosis, the psychiatrist said, no, you're not ADHD, you have extreme anxiety. Well, that could be true, because when you have anxiety, you're not able to think straight. Your brain might be scattered and all over the place. However, many people with ADHD also experience anxiety. So it can be the opposite as well. And ADHD can also be because of trauma. So you can be diagnosed with ADHD because that's how your mind is created to be, or it could come as, what am I trying to say? It can come on because of trauma. And so once I began investigating what ADHD was because of my friend, my entire life suddenly made sense.
Share a bit more about
that. I grew up as a product of the 80s. And I'm going to be super honest about what this means for ADHD and what the journey looks like. In the 80s, it was very common for the hyperactive boy to be diagnosed with ADHD. It was less common for a girl who wasn't attentive to be diagnosed with ADHD or ADD. So what I have is inattentive ADHD. And what that looked like growing up was I daydreamed, I doodled in class, couldn't hear what the teacher was saying, didn't process it, wasn't interesting to me. I was in my own world. These are a lot of the things that you'll hear from other people in the ADHD or ADD community. Unable to focus. If I'm not interested in it, I'm not going to do it. I am 500% or 0%. I have extreme ability to hyperfocus. And what that looks like is if I'm interested, I go into hyperfocus mode, able to do the job of 10 people in a very short amount of time and get it done. So it looks like I'm an incredible worker. I mean, and I am, but if I'm not interested, forget about it. Nothing, not happening. My brain gets stuck there. I think in pictures, that has a little bit to do with ADHD. Had I been officially diagnosed as a child, my life would have been 100 times easier because I would have had the resources and help to help me through school, which was a huge challenge for me. Mm-hmm. I don't learn like other people. I learn by experiencing. I don't learn through lecture. I have to experience and engage in my learning process. Had that been understood, my entire education process would have been different. Now, later on in college, I found a university by accident who happened to have a teaching style for adult learners that was very much hands-on. You're engaged in the process. You answer questions. You get to ask questions. One of the things about ADHD is we're very curious, extremely curious minds. We have the ability to think creatively, think way outside the box, and have a zillion ideas and perhaps get only one of those ideas done. And I will say every single team needs to have someone with ADHD on it because you will never run out of ideas. Extremely creative thinkers. I know it's been said that ADHD people might be more prone to, especially children, might be more prone to jump into something that is a risk and be harmful. So parents have to watch for that.
So take me to that moment where your friend said, Christelle, do you think you have ADHD, or have you ever considered you might have ADHD? What went through your mind at that time? Was it relief? Was it, did you deny it? Did you, how did you react?
I think it was kind of like that could make sense, but I'm an adult, so it doesn't make sense. And my friend was so matter of fact about it. No, you do. And she knows me so well that I believed her, to be honest. It wasn't like I denied it. It was more of an aha moment that I wanted to look into further. And thus began my journey of researching and figuring it out and finding communities where other ADHD people were. And we all had such similar stories. I mean, even down to, James, I got my hearing tested. I cannot tell you how many times, and my hearing was just fine. And the reason I heard this story over and over in the ADHD community, the reason why I say this is because ADHD people tune out. Again, I said I have inattentive ADHD. That means I tune out and just shut off. Like, I'm in my own head. There's a lot happening in my head and I just shut down. And so those kind of stories I began to realize was so common in the ADHD community. So I found people with common stories that I could relate to. But the other thing I did is I wanted an official diagnosis. So going back to what I said before, the first time I went to get an official diagnosis, she would not diagnose me with ADHD. It wasn't until maybe 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, that I did get my official diagnosis. And the trick with that is I have also lived with trauma for a very long time. So you have trauma that coincides with ADHD, which can get very tricky there. But I did finally receive an official diagnosis. For me, it was a sense of relief, because those of us who are a little bit quirky or known to be a little bit quirky or off the wall, I found my community, and it also made sense of my entire life. And it helped me make sense of why I had so many learning challenges my entire life. Because once I was diagnosed with ADHD, I could also say, wait a minute, along with that can often be high sensitivity, or it can be, like I said, inattentive ADHD. This is why I zone out, or why if I'm not interested, I can't do it. It's like painful for me to do it. Or just a lot of the traits that go along with ADHD that suddenly made sense. So for me, that's the long answer as to my entire life now makes sense. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So what resources, or do you remember any books or resources that you looked at the time?
I went through, no, I scrolled online through websites and Facebook groups. I had a friend from high school who said, Christelle, you should look at what my wife has put together. She's done an entire Facebook group based on ADHD, and she wrote several books. So, and then he said he's ADHD and their entire family is ADHD. So I found my very first community there with stories that I related to. Did I read any books? That's a good question. I don't think I did. I don't think I even have yet. I found a very well-known doctor, and I'm going to forget his name. Haha, there's an ADHD moment for you there. I don't remember names. I found a very good doctor who also has ADHD and has written extensively about it. And that was one of my first resources that I thoroughly researched. I found a San Diego Resource Center specifically for ADHD and coaching.
Okay. So what did it feel like when the diagnosis came through?
Confirmation. I also had to fight for that diagnosis because, like I said, my first doctor didn't want to diagnose me with that, but I was pretty convinced by that point that that was the case, having done all the research, having looked at really good resource centers and realizing I fit, taking how many tests just to make sure. And so it was confirmation, because I really wanted to just make sense of why I do what I do. And that was important to me. And then to be able to surround myself with others who think like that. So what a relief to realize there's actually nothing wrong with you, but we live in a world where rules have been created as if those rules are the right way to live. But what if they're not? What if someone somewhere just said, this is the way life has to be, we're creating these rules, and if you don't live up to these rules, then there's something wrong with you? But what if half the world is actually ADHD? What if half the world does actually live outside these boxes that we don't even conceive of? An ADHD person, there's that whole reference to, we have to think outside the box. Do you know with ADHD, we don't even see a box. There's no box. We can't even conceive of that. So what if half the world is actually created to be that way for a specific reason? And interestingly enough, when I worked for Traveling Stories, which helps make reading fun for kids, I ran into and worked with people from different agencies. And one included an agency that discovered that ADHD actually goes back to primitive time. And there was a reason for your mind to be created in that way. And I can't remember everything that I discovered in that, but there's nothing wrong with us, is what I'm trying to say. Other than we don't fit into what is supposed to be normal. But what is normal? It's only because someone made that rule that this is normal and this isn't.
Yeah. So as we close this conversation about ADHD, Christelle, is there anyone that you would recommend or that you found helpful as you were discovering this for yourself?
Yes, I actually spoke about a doctor that puts out articles, and I learned a lot from in the beginning of my journey. His name is Dr. Ed or Ned Hallowell, MD. You can find him online at drhallowell.com. Go ahead and Google his name, and all kinds of information will come up. And funny enough, Dr. Hallowell's podcast, I believe, is called Distracted Podcast, which I love that title because I can relate immensely to it. And I have a feeling there's a lot to learn there. I'm about to go pop on and listen as well. And I did want to reference that everything we discussed today is my story, my experiences. I'm not a professional. I'm merely basing my journey on what my experience and adventures have been, and then my own personal research. So I would highly recommend that anyone who wants more information to look up some of the professionals and counselors such as Dr. Hallowell, ADD Magazine, and some of those.
That's great. Excellent. Do you think we'll get to the end of the list of 10 things that you learned about yourself in the last 10 years?
We started with number 1, ended up on number 2, and did a whole subject just on that.
Okay, great. Well, maybe next time we'll get to the end of Christelle's list, 3 to 10 things that she's learned about herself in the last 10 years. And maybe we'll learn a thing about some of the things I've learned in the last maybe 5 years or so. But that's it for the 5th episode of Ponderings from Across the Pond, in which we've delved deep into ADHD and discovering that as a diagnosis as an adult and what that's been like for Christelle. Do join us next time, and thanks for watching and listening. You can find links to all the things we've referred to below on the YouTube channel, and we will look forward to sharing more with you in about a week's time. Bye for now.
Bye. Oh, we need to come back.
Yep, because otherwise I can call you as attacker.
Forgot that we were recording.
That's okay, that's fine. I'm going to ask you about the doctor. So do you know the doctor's name?
I already forgot.
Okay.
Dr. Ed Hallowell, MD. Dr. Edward or Ned Hallowell, MD.
Do you write it down? Just to make sure.
Which happened to be ADHD, which is kind of funny. And by the way, this is funny too. Dr. Hallowell's podcast is called, I think it's Distracted Podcast, which perfectly sums up me.
Great. Well, maybe next.
Quite interesting. You want to do that again, my love? I got very distracted.